thick silence pressed down upon the land, suffocating, endless. Eldritch awoke, his body cold yet unfamiliar. He lay still for a moment, his mind struggling to grasp the new reality unfolding before him. The air was heavy, tainted with something ancient and unholy. Slowly he sat up, his fingers sinking into the ground beneath him. It was not earth. It pulsed as if it were alive, the surface slick with crimson. Blood. The land itself fed on it, drank it, thrived upon it. As far as his eyes could see, the horizon was endless and desolate, painted in shades of deep black and dying red. The sky overhead held no stars, no moon, only shifting clouds that churned like liquid shadow. Eldritch exhaled slowly, his breath shaky, not from exhaustion, but from something else, something he had not felt in centuries. Weakness. He looked down at his hands. They were unfamiliar, smooth, untouched by decay or the curse of undeath. Gone were the long withered fingers of a vampire elder. In their place were the hands of a man, young, strong, yet human. His heart pounded. He had a heartbeat. With trembling fingers, he touched his face. No scars, no withered flesh. His skin was firm, untouched by the centuries. He ran his fingers through his hair, thick and full, no longer the brittle strands of an ancient being. His breath hitched. He tried to move through the shadows, to disappear into them as he had done for so long. But nothing happened. No flicker of power, no shift into the void. He reached for something, anything, but the well of darkness he had drawn upon for centuries was gone. He was human again. Eldritch clenched his fists, trying to steady himself as a wave of unease crashed over him. It wasn't fear, not in the way mortals felt fear. It was something deeper, more primal. He knew where he was. This was Nocturna's domain, the afterlife of all elders, the inevitable end that so many had convinced themselves was myth. For all their arrogance, for all their claims of eternity, they were nothing but fleeting sparks in the endless cycle. And now he was here, in the heart of the abyss, where all elders came to serve the vampire god. Eldritch took a slow step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the blood-soaked earth. He did not know where he was going. There were no landmarks, no structures, only the endless horizon of black and crimson. But he walked, because that was all he could do. The wind howled softly in the distance, carrying with it whispers too faint to understand. Perhaps they were the voices of others who had come before him, lost souls wandering through Nocturna's grasp. Eldritch lifted his gaze to the empty sky. Was this eternity? A slow, meaningless march through a land that devoured all. His hands curled into fists. Nocturna would not break him. He had been many things in his lifetime, a man, a monster, an elder, but never had he been a slave. And if Nocturna believed he would bow like the others before him, he was mistaken. He was Eldritch, and he would not go quietly into the abyss. So he walked. Chapter 2. The Price of Power. Eldritch walked and walked. The desolate land stretched endlessly before him, an ocean of blackened crimson that pulsed beneath his every step. The sky remained void of stars, of a moon, of any semblance of life beyond the churning abyss of darkness above. The very air pressed against his skin, thick and oppressive, filled with whispers too faint to decipher. Then, in the distance, a figure. His heart quickened, not with hope, but with urgency. A shred of familiarity in this forsaken realm. He rushed forward, his breath heavy, though not from exhaustion. Human fragility, another cruel reminder of what he had become. As he neared, the figure came into view. A man, or what remained of one. His body was withered, his skin sagging over brittle bones. His hair, long and matted, draped over a face that had been worn by agony. His eyes, hollow and sunken, stared forward with a dull, endless emptiness. "Hello," Eldritch called, his voice breaking the unnatural stillness. The man barely reacted. Eldritch reached him, dropping to one knee, gripping his frail shoulders. "Are you all right?" The man slowly lifted his gaze, and his cracked lips parted, his voice weak and distant, barely more than a whisper. "This is our payment." Eldritch frowned. "Payment?" The man exhaled, long and slow, as if even breathing was a struggle. "To be fed upon forever." Eldritch felt the weight of those words before he even understood them. A chill ran through him, but before he could respond, the man pointed downward. Eldritch followed the motion. His stomach twisted. The black crimson beneath him was shifting, moving. The thick, parasitic substance coiled around his boots, pulsing, feeding. The land itself was drawing from him, devouring him. He stepped back instinctively, but it made no difference. The blood clung to him, tendrils wrapping around his feet like roots sinking into the ground. "The land is Nocturna," the man muttered. "It feeds as we once fed." Eldritch's hands curled into fists. This can't be the afterlife. This can't be all that there is." The man let out a hoarse, bitter laugh, though there was no joy in it. "We had our gift. Now we pay the price." His voice grew darker, as if his very essence was unravelling with each word. "An eternity of being consumed. The power we wielded in life was never ours. It was borrowed. Nocturna always takes his payment in the end." Eldritch shook his head. "No." His voice was firm, defiant. "No god rules over me." The man raised a trembling hand, pointing to the endless horizon. "Look." Eldritch followed his gaze, and what he saw sent a cold shudder through his body. The black crimson was not merely a river of liquid. It was a mass, a writhing, congealed mass of human limbs, bones and faces, some of which had long since melted into the pulsing substance, barely distinguishable, mouths frozen in silent screams, hands reaching, grasping, only to sink back into the abyss. This place was built on them, the blood of the fallen. "This is the price," the man said, his voice barely audible, "for the power we borrowed." Eldritch stared, the weight of it pressing down upon him. He had spent centuries seeking knowledge, bending the fabric of existence to his will. He had cheated death, stolen time, built a legacy upon shadows and whispers. And now he stood upon the remains of those who had come before him, those who had thought themselves eternal. A slow, creeping realization began to claw at the back of his mind. This was not an afterlife. This was a tomb built on the arrogance of those who had once called themselves gods. Eldritch kept moving, step after step. The vast, desolate expanse of Nocturna's realm stretched endlessly in all directions. Time no longer had meaning here. There was no sun and no moon, no change, only the ceaseless pull of the black-crimson mass beneath his feet, feeding upon him with each moment. His body, once powerful, was frail. His once boundless energy had been reduced to the sluggish endurance of a man. The awareness of his mortality gnawed at the edges of his mind, but he did not stop. To stop was to be consumed. Up ahead, another figure, tall, broad-shouldered, strong in stature, but already affected by this place. His steps were slow, his presence lacking the inhuman force of an elder. Eldritch called out, his voice breaking the silence. "Hello?" The man turned sharply, his expression tense. His sharp eyes studied Eldritch warily. "Where are we? I was just destroyed by a hunter, and then I appeared here." Eldritch walked up beside him. "We are in the realm of Nocturna," he said, gesturing toward the darkened sky. Then pointing down at their feet, he added, "And it seems this entire place is Nocturna." The man followed his gaze. His breath caught. The black-crimson substance had coiled around his boots, pulsing, drawing from him. "What is this?" the man rasped. "My power. It's gone. I am just a man." Eldritch exhaled slowly. "Come, we need to keep walking, or we will be consumed where we stand." The man hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together they walked, their footsteps slow and deliberate, each one resisting the pull of the feeding land beneath them. After some time, the man finally spoke. "I should introduce myself. I am Varric." Eldritch gave a nod of acknowledgement. "How long?" Varric sighed. "Nearly 40 years as an elder." He flexed his fingers, staring at his human hands in disbelief. Becoming a man again feels helpless. Eldritch glanced at his own hands, feeling the weight of mortality settle in his bones. "I have been an elder for many centuries. I had almost forgotten what this felt like." They continued walking, conversing as they went. They spoke of their past lives, their transformations, and the nature of this realm. They spoke of the arrogance of elders, of the illusion of their power, and the finality of their fate. Then, as the endless walk stretched on, Eldritch spoke of something different. "I once had a friend," he said. "A man, just a man." Varric scoffed lightly. "You, an elder, speaking so highly of a man." Eldritch smirked faintly. "He was the most powerful being I have ever known, more powerful than the gods combined." Varric stopped in his tracks. His eyes locked onto Eldritch with sudden intensity. "A man, more powerful than the gods." Eldritch nodded. "Can he save us?" Varric asked, almost desperately. Eldritch's expression darkened. "No," he said simply. "To do so would upset the balance, something he has sworn to protect." Varric was silent for a moment. Then he chuckled, a low, amused sound. "I know this winter you speak of." Eldritch's gaze sharpened. "You do?" Varric smirked. "Yes, he stole my power once." Eldritch narrowed his eyes. "Did he?" Varric nodded. "But I understood why." His voice grew distant, as if recalling something ancient. "And I must say, even I respect him." Yeah, then suddenly, Varric stopped walking. His form began to ripple, like a mirage bending under the weight of something far greater. Eldritch took a step back as the change unfolded before him. The figure of Varric twisted, his body shifting like liquid shadow. His once human flesh became something else entirely, something vast, something ancient. The air around them thickened, the weight of his presence growing oppressive. And then, in a voice that resonated through the very fabric of this realm, he spoke. "Excuse me, Eldritch. I wanted to know you." Eldritch's jaw tightened as realization dawned. He took another step back, his muscles tensing. "Nocturna." The being smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "Ah, you figured it out. Clever, clever." Eldritch's eyes darkened. "Are you expecting me to kneel?" Nocturna let out a deep chuckle. "No, no," he said, shaking his head. "You have me all wrong, Eldritch." The shadows around him shifted, his form stabilizing into something vaguely humanoid once more. His gaze was sharp, piercing. "I am a force. I am not evil. nor am I good. I am simply what is. Eldritch remained still, unmoving. I give my power freely to you, elders, Nocturna continued, his voice carrying a strange warmth. You take it, you use it, and in return, you will feed me forever. Eldritch's expression was unreadable. He did not flinch, did not speak. Nocturna's smile widened, his presence more overwhelming than before. Now come, he said, gesturing forward. Let us walk a bit more. I would really love to chat. And so, Eldritch walked with Nocturna, the god of vampires himself. Chapter 4. The Trade of Power. You see, Eldritch, Nocturna mused as they walked across the endless blood-soaked plains. I am very much like you. I understand you and your way of thinking. His voice was smooth, rich, with an almost amused undertone. The vampire god strode beside Eldritch, as though they were nothing more than two equals engaged in conversation. But the weight of his presence was suffocating. Eldritch had spoken with kings, elders, and ancient creatures before, but never had he felt such vastness in a single being. I offer a trade, Nocturna continued. I give you power. You accept it. Wield it for as long as you can, with no restrictions, no limits. I put no time stamp on it. Use it until you burn out, until your body crumbles, until you have taken everything you can from it. And when it is finished, you pay for that power. He turned his dark, glimmering eyes towards Eldritch. After all, isn't that your code? Fair trade in all things? Eldritch's expression remained unreadable. His steps did not falter, but his voice carried a quiet defiance. Yes, but this hardly seems fair. We never knew the price. Nocturna halted suddenly, his gaze sharpening. Because you never ask. The words struck like a thunderclap. The very ground beneath them trembled. A ripple spread across the crimson-black surface, as if the realm itself reacted to its master's fury. Then, as quickly as the outburst came, it faded. Nocturna exhaled deeply, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of centuries of frustration. Oh, excuse me, he muttered, shaking his head. Sometimes I get very hot-tempered. Hundreds of years of complaints, it really does wear on one's patience. He gestured for them to keep walking, his mood seemingly lightened. Now tell me, Eldritch, you knew Winter well. How is he able to wield such power as a man? His mind must be something supernatural. Eldritch did not answer immediately. He kept his gaze forward, watching the endless horizon as he walked beside a god. No, he finally said. He's just a man. He had a purpose and the will to see it through. Nocturna's brows furrowed, his amusement flickering into something darker. A man could never best me, he snapped, his voice vibrating through the air. The sky above them seemed to shift, the swirling darkness above twisting angrily. Then, as if catching himself, Nocturna exhaled and waved a dismissive hand. Oh, there I go again, that temper of mine. He chuckled, though his smile did not reach his eyes. He cast a sidelong glance at Eldritch. Do you think there is a way to take his knowledge and use it? Eldritch smirked faintly. I don't think you're powerful enough for that. Nocturna stopped walking. His expression darkened. You dare? The very air turned heavy, suffocating. The black-crimson ground beneath them slithered and pulsed, coiling like a living thing. Then Nocturna laughed, a slow, rumbling sound that was almost entertained. Oh, "Oh, so sorry. I'm not used to speaking with mortals," he said, shaking his head. "I forget how fragile you all are." Eldritch narrowed his eyes. "So let me get this straight. Your idea of a fair trade is to give a few years of power in exchange for an eternity of suffering." He scoffed. "That sounds more like theft, especially considering the buyer never even knows the price." Nocturna grinned. "You could have always said no." Eldritch let out a dry, bitter laugh. "But no one ever does." "Exactly," Nocturna beamed. "Power! Power! More power! It's all you ever ask for. You take and take and take. But when it's time to pay," he sighed dramatically, "complain, complain, complain." Eldritch didn't respond. He simply walked, and Nocturna walked beside him. They travelled deeper into the endless void, speaking of many things: morality, power, the illusion of eternity. They spoke of gods and men, of bargains and their consequences. And through it all, Eldritch listened, because for the first time he was speaking with the very thing he had spent centuries defying, the one truth that no elder had ever escaped, the force that had always been watching. Chapter 5: A Different Kind of Prison. "I like you, Eldritch," Nocturna mused, his voice carrying across the endless abyss of Nocturna's feeding grounds. "There is something about you. Your strength, your will, your code." Eldritch scoffed. "You mean the fact that Winter was my friend, that I saw him as the most powerful being?" The smile on Nocturna's face did not waver, but the air around him did. The very realm itself trembled in response to his unspoken anger. For a long moment, Nocturna said nothing. Then, with forced lightness, he waved a hand dismissively. "Well, let's not dwell on that," he said, his voice smooth but just a shade too controlled. "I want you to think of me as your friend too. I want you to see me as I truly am, the most powerful of the gods." Eldritch narrowed his eyes, but he remained silent. Nocturna continued, gesturing around them. "I select certain powerful allies, those who prove themselves worthy, to continue their existence within my realm without being devoured. You see, Eldritch, I am not without mercy." A slow, knowing smile stretched across his face. With a simple wave of his hand, the land before them changed. The dark, parasitic expanse of blood and suffering vanished, replaced by something entirely different. A town. It was small, but lively. The land here was fresh, untouched by the horror that stretched beyond it. Greenery stretched across rolling hills. Trees with crimson leaves swayed gently in an unseen wind. The air smelled different. Clean, if such a thing could exist in a god's prison. Scattered among the streets were people, elders, or rather, those who had once been. They looked human, like Eldritch did now, their vampire bodies stripped away, yet they did not seem to be suffering. They walked freely, some laughing, some speaking in hushed voices, others simply existing in a way that was utterly foreign to the nightmare Eldritch had just endured. Nocturna's voice was calm, almost warm. "Come, Eldritch. Let us leave that other place behind. You are not meant for the feed. You are meant for greater things." Eldritch didn't move immediately. His sharp gaze flickered from Nocturna to the town before him. Skepticism etched across his face. "And what is this place, exactly?" Nocturna chuckled, stepping beside him. "This is my gift to those I choose to keep. You see, I have others, other powerful beings, once elders, whom I can return to the world should I wish. They live here, growing in strength and knowledge." His gaze darkened slightly. "Just like you, and just like Winter." Eldritch turned his head sharply at that. Nocturna grinned. I'll leave you here for now. Get used to the place. It's far better than the alternative, wouldn't you say?" He gestured behind them, where the black-crimson wasteland still loomed, stretching forever into the horizon. Eldritch let out a slow breath. It was still a prison, but it was a different kind of prison. A silence hung between them for a moment before Eldritch spoke. "One last thing, Nocturna." Nocturna paused, raising an eyebrow. "You mentioned you could return elders if you wished," Eldritch said carefully. "Have you done so since winter reset reality?" For the first time, the expression on Nocturna's face changed. Hatred, pure, raw, unfiltered hatred. It was there for only a fraction of a second before his face smoothed back into neutrality. But Eldritch had seen it. Nocturna's voice, when he spoke, was calm, but the weight beneath it was dangerous. "No," he said simply. "To do so would upset the balance, and then winter would come for me." Eldritch said nothing. Nocturna smiled again, but there was something behind it now, something hidden, something fearful. "Enjoy your new home, Eldritch," he said. Then, with a flicker of shadow, he was gone. Eldritch turned back to the town. He took his first steps toward it, his sharp mind already working, already questioning. He had left the suffering of the endless wasteland behind, but he had walked into something else entirely, and he was sure this was only the beginning. Eldritch stepped forward, his boots pressing against the cobblestone streets of the town. The air was thick, suffocating, not with heat, but with something unseen, something heavy. The sky above was locked in perpetual twilight, an abyss of swirling black and crimson, shifting like the breathing of some unseen entity. As he walked, shutters slammed shut, doors creaked and groaned as they were locked from the inside. Figures once visible in windows turned away, vanishing into the dim, candle-lit interiors of their homes. The entire town recoiled from him, as though he were an intruder. The architecture was ancient, untouched by time. Stone houses with thatched roofs, wooden beams weathered with age. There was no electricity, no hum of modern life, only the dim flicker of oil lanterns hanging from rusted hooks, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch too far. The people, they were darker still. They moved with an unnatural stillness, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. Some wore expressions of resignation, others of quiet fear. These were not mortals, nor were they elders in the way Eldritch had known them to be. They were prisoners, each one carefully selected, hand-picked by Nocturna. Why? Some perhaps had been powerful in life, elders of great renown held in reserve should Nocturna need them. Others, scholars and sages, trapped here for the knowledge they held. And some were simply playthings, trophies of a god's amusement. But none of them spoke to Eldritch. He continued his path through the lifeless streets, the sound of his own footsteps echoing too loudly. The dread of the place seeped into his very bones, a slow, creeping thing that whispered to him in silence. Then ahead he saw it. A house, larger, more prominent than the others, standing at the very heart of the town. Its structure loomed over the smaller buildings, its presence casting a deep, unnatural shadow upon the street. The windows were dark, the door shut tight, but something about it felt alive. Eldritch halted. A chill ran through him, one he had not felt in centuries. Then movement. A woman stood across the street, her form barely illuminated by the dim glow of lanterns. Her face was hidden beneath a tattered veil, her body wrapped in a flowing black dress that moved slightly, though there was no wind. She was staring at him. Eldritch took a step toward her. "Who lives there?" The woman did not answer at first. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far away, something that spoke only to her. Then, in a murmur, soft, distant, and yet filled with something heavy, she whispered, "The beast!" A slow, paralyzing silence filled the space between them. Eldritch felt something shift in the air, an unseen weight pressing against him, as if the very town itself had held its breath. This was no ordinary place. This was no ordinary afterlife. This was a cage for beings who had once been more than gods, now stripped of power, kept as trophies, as pets, as weapons waiting to be unleashed. Eldritch knew what this was. It was Nocturna's collection, and he was now part of it. Eldritch moved towards the large building. The closer he got, the more it stood out. Unlike the rest of the town, which felt abandoned, broken and decayed, this building was different, almost regal, a structure of power standing defiantly in the heart of a village of the damned. He could feel it, the weight of something watching him, waiting. "You there, over here?" A voice, low, urgent. Eldritch turned sharply, his instincts flaring. To his right, a narrow alleyway drowned in darkness, a figure barely visible within. He clenched his fists, feeling the limits of his new, fragile body. He was no longer an elder, no longer untouchable. A trap could mean his end. "Show yourself," Eldritch commanded. The figure hesitated, then stepped forward, just enough to be seen. Eldritch's breath caught. He knew that face. A vampire he had met centuries ago, a powerful elder in his time, now reduced to a frail, nervous man, his once imposing figure hunched as though he carried a weight too great for him. His once brilliant golden eyes had dulled, replaced with something hollow. "Eldritch," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. "It's me, Varos." For the first time since he arrived in this wretched place, Eldritch felt something real. "Varos," he murmured, stepping forward, his caution fading for a moment. Varos nodded quickly. "Come, not here." Eldritch followed as Varos led him through the twisting streets of the town, moving like a man always expecting danger. They stopped at a small, decrepit house, tucked between two other worn-down buildings. The door creaked as they entered, and inside, the room was simple. A wooden table, a few chairs, a fireplace, where a small flame struggled to fight off the eternal cold of Nocturna's realm. Varos gestured for Eldritch to sit, taking a seat across from him near the fire. "You look terrible," Eldritch said, studying his old acquaintance. Varos let out a dry laugh. "You should have seen me in the feeding grounds. Compared to that nightmare, this place is merciful." His expression darkened, and then, almost mechanically, he added, "Nocturna is merciful. He's powerful. We are grateful to share this place. We praise Nocturna and his mercy." Eldritch's eyes narrowed. The way Varos said it was unnatural, rehearsed, forced. "So," Eldritch said slowly, watching Varos's reaction, "he knows everything that happens here, I take it?" Varos gave a slow, deliberate nod. Silence fell between them for a moment. The fire crackled weakly. Then Varos sighed, rubbing his face, as if the very act of speaking was exhausting. "How did you get here, Eldritch?" Eldritch exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Cithrus!" Varos flinched at the name. "Ah, so he finally got you too." "Yes." Eldritch glanced at the fire. "And I suppose we all end up here, one way or another. The cycle continues." Varos gave a bitter chuckle. "Yes, the cycle. They sat in silence, the weight of the afterlife pressing against them both. Then Eldritch finally asked, "Who lives in that house? The large one at the centre of town?" Varos's expression darkened. His hands tightened into fists, his knuckles pale. He looked away from Eldritch, staring into the flickering flames. "Do not go there, Eldritch," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eldritch leaned forward. "Why?" Varos swallowed. "The beast." The room felt colder at those words. "Many come here, Eldritch," Varos continued, his voice hollow. "But many also disappear. We know it's him. He takes them, and once they are taken, they do not return." Eldritch watched Varos carefully. Even now, without his powers, Varos let out a shaky breath. "Even as a man, he is mad with bloodlust." His voice dropped lower. "The thirst never left him, and he takes it out on those trapped here." A shadow passed over Varos's face. Fear, real fear. Eldritch leaned back, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. So Nocturna collected elders, kept them, shaped them, perhaps even prepared them for something. But this was different. This was something he had to see for himself. After a long silence, Eldritch finally spoke. "I need to go there." Varos's face darkened, his eyes filling with something between fear and resignation. "Eldritch," he said quietly, "don't. This is not my fate." Eldritch continued, standing. "And Nocturna knows it. He put me here to go and confront this so-called beast, and so I will." Varos exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Be careful," he muttered. "He is not like us. I think he was evil before he became an elder. Even today, many go missing in the night. We know he tortures them, kills them." Varos swallowed. "He does it to satisfy an urge." Eldritch met his gaze. Then that urge must be answered. Varos didn't argue. There was no point. He simply sighed, nodding once. And so Eldritch left, walking alone through the town's lifeless streets, heading toward the house at its centre. Far above, unseen by mortal eyes, Nocturna watched. A slow, wicked smile stretched across his lips as he observed the scene below. He had known this confrontation was inevitable. It was in Eldritch's nature to seek out the truth, just as it was in his nature to watch. It was all a game, and Nocturna loved his games. Eldritch reached the house. Stepping onto the worn stone steps, he raised a fist and banged on the heavy wooden door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then shouting. A muffled voice, deep and furious, roaring something unintelligible. Beneath it, the unmistakable sound of screaming, agony. A person in pain. The door creaked open. A woman stood before him, drained. Her body was covered in bruises, her arms wrapped in old scars, her lips split and barely healed. She had the look of someone long past fear, someone who had learned that fear meant nothing when there was no escape. Eldritch met her empty gaze. "I wish to see the owner of this place." She hesitated, then gave a small shake of her head, a warning. Then from deep within the house, a booming voice. "Let him in." The woman swallowed hard, stepping aside. Eldritch entered. The air inside was thick, heavy with something rotten. The floors, once polished wood, were stained, not with blood, but with something darker, something sickly. The flickering firelight barely illuminated the walls, which were lined with old ruined banners, as though the house had once belonged to a warrior of great renown. A massive chair faced the fireplace, a hulking figure seated within it, his form hidden in the shadows. A voice, deep, amused, unhinged. "Come, Eldritch," the figure said. "He told me you would come." Eldritch stepped forward, his body tensed as his gaze fixed on the man before him. Then, realization. The figure rose from the chair. Tall, broad shoulders, muscles rippling beneath the tattered shirt stretched across his frame. A thick, tangled beard covered his face, and his eyes, wild and burning with something dark, locked onto Eldritch with recognition. He moved with the ease of a warrior from an age long past, a relic of brutality given form, a voice thick with a Scottish accent. "Come, sit by my fire." Eldritch's breath caught in his throat. He knew this man, and he spoke his name in a whisper. "Duncan MacDrustan." Duncan laughed, a deep, guttural sound, filled with madness. Before Eldritch could respond, his gaze drifted downward. A man lay crumpled on the floor, beaten, blooded, broken. Duncan snarled, "Get out of here! Can't you see we have a guest?" The beaten man scrambled away, crawling with what little strength he had left. He disappeared into the darkness, his ragged breathing the only proof he was still alive. Duncan followed Eldritch's gaze, chuckling darkly. "This place is perfect, Eldritch," he said, his tone filled with something deeply unsettling. "They're already dead. No matter what you do to them, they don't die. It's almost heaven." His grin widened, his teeth yellowed and sharp. "I can beat them as hard as I want, tear them apart, but they never die. Never." His words trailed into something incoherent, muttered, a slur of ramblings that carried the weight of a man utterly consumed by madness. Eldritch remained still, watching him carefully. Duncan's laughter echoed through the room, his head tilting slightly. "He keeps me here, you know. He teases me with these playthings. But one day..." His fingers twitched, his massive hands curling into fists. "One day, he will free me back into the world, where I will fulfill my destiny." He looked at Eldritch now, his eyes gleaming. "You should have seen us, Eldritch, Azrael and I." His voice grew nostalgic. "We were a force of pure destruction." Eldritch nodded slowly. "I have heard of your exploits, Master." Duncan froze. The room went still. Then slowly, ever so slowly, he turned his gaze fully upon Eldritch. "No one has called me that for a long time," Duncan muttered, his voice quieter. "Not since..." Then his face changed. Recognition. "Wait," Duncan said. His lips curled, his teeth grinding together. "He was a friend of yours, wasn't he?" Eldritch remained silent. Duncan sneered. "That no-good cheating elder." A pulse of rage passed over his face, his nostrils flaring. "He cheated in our fight." Duncan growled. "I won. I beat them all. No one defeats the Master. No one." His roar shook the room, his entire body trembling, his muscles flexing, as if preparing to lash out at something unseen. Eldritch's sharp eyes didn't miss it. The way Duncan twitched, his hands clenching and unclenching, his shoulders hunched forward like an addict craving his next dose. He needed something. Duncan turned, snapping his fingers. A frail servant appeared instantly, and without hesitation, Duncan struck, a savage blow sending the servant sprawling. Another strike, and another. The man collapsed to the ground, twitching, his body barely clinging to life, and Duncan only smiled. Something dark and wet splattered across his face. He inhaled deeply, savouring it. His hands trembled. His breath came in ragged, hungry gasps. Eldritch watched. Duncan MacDrustan was not a warrior. He was not even a man. He was something else, something twisted, something wrong. And as Duncan turned back to him, grinning through bloodied teeth, Eldritch knew one thing. This was not just a confrontation. This was a reckoning. Eldritch watched cautiously. Duncan's movements were unpredictable, his mind shifting from madness to laughter and back again in the space of a breath. The massive warrior paced, speaking with the confidence of a man who believed himself unbreakable. Eldritch studied him, then finally spoke. "So how will he send you back?" Duncan roared with laughter, a booming, guttural sound. His entire body shook with it, as if the very question was absurd, from a crazed man to a jovial one in seconds. "He will send me back," Duncan said, grinning, "when the job cannot be done by the weak, when the world requires the strongest, the unstoppable. That is when he will call for me." Eldritch nodded slowly, his mind calculating. Then, risking much, he replied, "Nocturna told me something different." Duncan's expression froze. Eldritch continued, his voice measured. "He told me he cannot send anyone back, that to do so would upset the balance, and to upset the balance would bring the keeper of the balance to Nocturna's door." Silence. Duncan's fingers twitched. His entire body went rigid. "He promised me my return," Duncan said, his voice quiet but dangerous. "He does not lie." "I do not think he does," Eldritch replied carefully. "After all, he told me the truth." Duncan said nothing. His jaw tightened, his breathing shallow and sharp. Then, without warning, he smiled again. "Come, Eldritch," Duncan said. "Follow me." Eldritch hesitated, then walked alongside him. They left the house, stepping into the cold, twilight-lit streets. The town was silent as they passed, doors locked, windows shut tight. The people knew better than to watch whatever Duncan MacDrustan was doing. They reached the edge of town, where the eternal feeding ground of Nocturna's realm met the land of the village. Eldritch's eyes narrowed. There, piled upon each other, hundreds of bodies, not dead, not alive either. They squirmed, shifting in endless agony, their flesh writhing, melting, dissolving at an impossible pace. Faces frozen in silent screams, limbs twisting into the black crimson of Nocturna's feeding ground, and Duncan, with the glee of a madman, pointed. "There," he said, voice filled with satisfaction. "He sends them to me. I cannot kill the already dead." He grinned wider, his eyes alight with something feral. "But I can put them here, and watch them slowly dissolve." Eldritch felt the weight of those words. This was entertainment to Duncan, the suffering of others, his amusement. Duncan tilted his head slightly, his massive form looming over Eldritch. "I wonder, Eldritch," he mused, his tone shifting, growing low and hungry. Did he send you here, so that I may do the same to you?" Eldritch did not move, did not react, because in that moment he knew Duncan was testing him, and if he showed fear, he would not walk away. Eldritch calculated his response carefully. Duncan was unpredictable, teetering between madness and aggression. A single wrong word, a misstep in tone, and the brute would turn on him like a rabid beast. He took a slow breath and spoke, his voice calm, unwavering. "Force should never be initiated against another," Eldritch began. "To do so is to abandon reason in favour of brute power. A man who chooses to use force as his first means of action has already surrendered his mind. He admits, without speaking, that he has no way to convince others, that his will alone is insufficient." Duncan squinted, his large, scarred hands curling into fists as he tried to grasp Eldritch's words. "But a man who is prepared to use force in return, that is a different matter entirely," Eldritch continued, watching Duncan's reaction. "For such a man does not seek violence, but understands its necessity. He will act only when he must, when there is no other choice. And when he does," Eldritch's voice grew colder, sharper, "the outcome is always terrible." Duncan stood there, staring, trying to understand. He did not fully grasp Eldritch's words, but he felt them. Something about them rang true in his core. Even if his mind couldn't shape the meaning, he had to either agree or admit that Eldritch was his superior, and that was something a man like Duncan could never do. So instead, he simply grunted and motioned for Eldritch to return to the house. They walked in silence for a time, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Duncan's shoulders seemed to relax, if only slightly. He exhaled through his nose, thinking, then spoke. "So why, then?" he asked, his tone quieter now. "Do you think he sent you to me?" Eldritch glanced at him. "Do you think he wants to see who is strongest?" A trap. Eldritch knew instantly. If he said yes, Duncan would attack him on the spot. If he said no, Duncan would believe it a lie, a ruse meant to disarm him. So Eldritch did what he always did. He adapted. He lied. "I am weak," Eldritch said plainly. "The last real battle I fought, I lost. I doubt one as intelligent as Nocturna would consider me a replacement for you." Duncan considered this, narrowing his eyes. Then Eldritch added, carefully placing the next piece of the game. "But," Duncan grunted, "but what?" Eldritch turned to him. "I have spent much time with the Keeper of the Balance. Perhaps Nocturna is seeking another way to send his strongest back." A double rebuttal, a subtle redirection, leaving Duncan with no opening. If he rejected the idea, he would be calling himself weak. If he accepted it, it meant Nocturna still had a purpose for him. Duncan exhaled, outsmarted, and simply nodded as they continued walking. Far above them, Nocturna watched. He did not care for either of these two men. He did not care who was stronger or who was weaker. He simply enjoyed the game. A day passed. Eldritch remained in Duncan's home, a guest in a house that reeked of violence and madness. Even in the quiet of his room, he could hear the beatings, the screams, new voices, each carrying fresh agony. It did not stop. Duncan's hunger for destruction was insatiable. Then, silence. Not just a pause between the suffering. Something else. Something unnatural. Eldritch sat still, listening. In the absence of sound, he thought. He planned. What would Winter do? Winter, a mere man, had defeated gods. Not with strength, not with power, but with knowledge, precision. Eldritch exhaled slowly. I must pull from that. A knock on the door. Eldritch turned. Once again, the battered woman stood there, her eyes hollow, her body trembling. She did not speak. She simply gestured for him to follow. Without a word, he rose and obeyed. She led him downward, beneath the house, into a vast underground hall. Larger than it should be. The ceilings stretched high, flickering torchlight, casting eerie shadows across the stone walls. Seated around the edges of the hall were 20 or so men and women, clearly of high standing in this wretched place. Elders, stripped of power, but still clinging to whatever remnants of authority they could claim, and in the centre of the hall, Duncan. The woman gestured for Eldritch to sit. He did, and he watched. A man was pushed into the centre of the hall. He stumbled, barely able to keep his footing. A sacrifice. Duncan turned, grinning. Without hesitation, he attacked. The man did not stand a chance. Duncan's ferocity was unmatched. Pure power. His fists landed with sickening cracks, his laughter echoing through the chamber as the man was beaten to the ground, broken, unable to fight back. Then, a voice. "No, no." Eldritch's stomach dropped. Varos, his old friend, was shoved forward, forced into the centre of the hall. A new opponent. Eldritch's eyes narrowed. This is a trap. They wanted to drag him into the fray, to force him to fight Duncan, to break him in front of the others. Eldritch's mind raced. Think, Eldritch, think. Winter, what would you do? Winter would already have the solution. Duncan raised his fists, ready to end Varos, and then Eldritch stood, his voice cut through the room like a blade. Pathetic. Silence. Every eye turned to him. Eldritch stepped forward. What kind of fight is this, when no one can actually die? His voice was sharp, filled with mockery. We are in the realm of Nocturna, and I see children playing with toys. Compared to the way we once hunted, compared to the way we killed, this is nothing. The room was dead silent. Duncan's fists clenched. Rage, confusion. He wanted to strike Eldritch down, but could not find the reason. Finally, someone in the crowd spoke. What do you suggest? Eldritch calculated. Every move had to be precise. He exhaled slowly. Something where there is at least a chance of destruction. His gaze swept over the gathered elders. This is like a child's playground, a game with no real stakes. We, who have fed on millions, are reduced to watching pretend battles. Some in the crowd muttered in agreement. Duncan was raging. I'll fight anyone, even you, Eldritch. Eldritch smirked. And what would that prove? Neither of us can die. We have already died once. A second voice called out. Then what do you suggest? Eldritch let the silence linger. Then he spoke. I've only been here a short time, but it seems to me that in this place, no matter what happens, we will not die. He let the words sink in. But out there, he turned his head towards the entrance, toward the eternal feeding grounds. Out there is a chance you won't come back. Murmurs spread through the gathered elders. Some stiffened, some leaned forward with curiosity. Eldritch continued, I suggest a hunt. The crowd stilled. Eldritch's voice was measured, confident. 2 enter. 1 comes back. The other is consumed. Silence. Then the crowd erupted. Shouts, cheers, excitement. Yes, some called. The hunt, the hunt. Duncan grinned. I will leave my opponent broken, unable to return in moments. Eldritch stood tall. Not him? The crowd went silent again. Duncan's grin faltered. Eldritch locked eyes with him. Me. Duncan's lips curled, his fists tightened. Then slowly, he smiled. A slow, twisted grin. This was not anger. This was excitement. Far above them, unseen by mortal eyes, Nocturna watched. He laughed. Eldritch stood at the edge of the feeding grounds, staring into the endless expanse of shifting, parasitic blood that pulsed beneath a sky of swirling black and crimson. Beside him, Varos was tense, his face twisted with frustration. This is madness, Eldritch, he muttered. You should have let me take the beating. I would have survived. Eldritch turned slightly, his expression unreadable. This has to stop, Varos continued. We are elders, not playthings. Eldritch smirked. I agree. Varos frowned. Then why are you going through with this? Eldritch exhaled slowly. Because I have a plan. He looked back at the gathered crowd, the 20 or so elders standing at the edge of the feeding grounds, their faces lit by flickering torches. They were eager for blood, for entertainment. Only one could come back. The other would be trapped forever, consumed by the feeding grounds, just like the thousands of souls writhing beneath the surface. Eldritch turned back toward the abyss. I will leave first. Duncan's gaze snapped to him, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles cracked. Give me 10 minutes, Eldritch continued. Then come after me, Duncan, if you dare. Duncan's body trembled, unstable. Eldritch could see it, the uncontrollable rage boiling beneath the surface, barely contained. If Duncan caught him, that would be the end of Eldritch. He could not fight Duncan, not physically, but who needs to fight when they have intellect? Eldritch stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the sickly, pulsing terrain of the feeding grounds. He turned his head one last time and smirked. 10 minutes, Duncan? Then come meet me for the fight of your life, master. Duncan's body shook violently, his muscles twitching, his face twisting into something inhuman. He was beyond rage. Eldritch could hear his ragged, boiling breath, could see the veins bulging along his thick arms. Duncan could hardly contain himself, like a volcano ready to explode. And as Eldritch ran out into the feeding grounds, disappearing into the shifting abyss, he whispered to himself, "Now let's see how well you play my game." Eldritch ran, the endless mass of black-crimson flesh pulling at his boots, threatening to drag him under. He could already feel the feeding grounds draining him, leeching his essence like a parasite. "Pace yourself, Eldritch," he told himself. "Don't panic. Don't rush." Behind him, Duncan was a raging storm, his howls splitting the unnatural sky, his footsteps like thunder. "I'm coming for you, Eldritch. You will die screaming." Eldritch forced himself to keep moving, his mind already set on his plan. He remembered a particular area, one that had caught his attention when he first travelled through this wretched place. A mass of congealed bodies, half devoured by the feeding ground. The terrain was unstable, a place where the dead did not simply sink, but were pulled under by the collective agony of those already trapped. Eldritch, smaller, faster, lighter, could navigate it. Duncan, massive, unstoppable, blinded by bloodlust, would not. The ground shifted beneath him, tendrils of melted bodies stretching toward him, hungry. Eldritch jumped over them, his boots barely finding enough stability to keep moving forward. The closer he got, the more the land pulled at him, sensing new prey. "Move, Eldritch. Move before you get pulled under." The moment he passed the unstable ground, he stopped. Now on firmer terrain, he turned, waiting. His breath was ragged, his body weakened, his energy being fed upon even now. But he smiled, because Duncan had arrived. Duncan sprinted, eyes bloodshot, his rage consuming every thought. He did not see the trap, did not feel the ground shifting beneath him. He only saw Eldritch, standing, mocking him. With full force, Duncan charged, and his pace slowed. Step by step, his massive frame weighed him down. The ground clung to him, wrapping around his boots, his shins, his knees, swallowing him. Eldritch watched as Duncan struggled, his mind lost to the frenzy of bloodlust. Yet, the more he fought, the faster he sank. Then Duncan stopped. For the first time, perhaps ever, he was stuck. Eldritch stepped forward slightly, smirking. "I knew Nocturna favoured me over a brute." Duncan's eyes snapped up, pure mindless hatred consuming him. Eldritch continued, voice calm, measured, cutting. "He was never going to send you back, Duncan. Why do you think he kept you here all this time? If he truly wanted to return you to the world, he would have done it already. He would not have sent me." Duncan roared, thrashing, but his struggles only sank him deeper. The black-crimson mass climbed to his waist, yet his power never faded, his strength never wavered. He would struggle until the end. Eldritch let the words drip from his tongue like poison. "I walked over this land like a cat, Duncan, yet Nocturna holds you down. Why is that?" Duncan's body writhed harder, his every movement an explosion of pure fury, but it only helped him sink faster. Chest, shoulders, only his head remained above the surface. Eldritch tilted his head back, as if speaking to the sky itself. I have done what you asked. Nocturna. I have disposed of this one, the one you were bored with. Now you can send me back. Duncan froze. His mind, clouded by rage, suddenly registered the words. The realization hit him like a hammer. Nocturna, you lied to me. His final scream was not of rage, but betrayal. I will destroy you. And then the ground consumed him. His head disappeared, leaving only the rippling abyss in his wake. Eldritch stood for a moment, staring at the place Duncan had been. Then, without looking back, he turned and walked toward the town. Above, unseen, Nocturna laughed. Eldritch emerged from the feeding grounds, stepping onto solid land once more. The warmth of the torches greeted him, their flickering light, a stark contrast to the consuming darkness he had left behind. A moment of silence. Then, you did it! Varos rushed to him, grabbing him by the shoulders. His eyes shone with relief, with disbelief. And then the others cheered. We are free of him! The 20 elders, who had once watched the fight, erupted into celebration, their voices calling his name. Eldritch! 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 Doors opened in the town. Laughter rang out. Laughter that had not been heard in centuries. Men and women, once proud elders, reduced to shadows of themselves, now stepped from their homes. Freed from the grip of the master, they celebrated, clapped him on the back, praised him. Eldritch forced a smile, but he felt nothing, because he knew better than them. Meanwhile, in the feeding grounds, the black-crimson mass swirled violently, its surface shifting, unsettled. Then a hand, a massive, battle-worn hand, plunged through the abyss. It gripped something, and with effortless strength, it pulled. From the depths of the feeding ground, an unconscious Duncan MacDrustan was dragged free, limp, broken, defeated, and yet not lost. A figure loomed over him, his presence twisting the air itself, bending reality. Nocturna. His form was human, or at least something close to it, tall, slender, his eyes twin pits of infinite night. He looked down at Duncan's body with an expression of mock sympathy, brushing the filth from his champion's ruined armour. He sighed. Oh dear, he mused. Twice now have you failed me. His voice was amused, but not unkind. He knelt beside Duncan, tapping his cheek lightly, as if waking a sleeping child. But I cannot let you go, my champion. He ran his fingers across Duncan's chest, tracing invisible patterns, feeling the remains of his shattered power. No, no, Nocturna whispered. You are far too valuable for that. He turned his head slightly, as if looking into something unseen, something beyond mortal perception. Come, rest with Azrael, away from them, away from those who would mock you. A snap of his fingers, and Duncan's broken body vanished, swallowed by the shadows. Nocturna stood, dusting off his hands, looking toward the town, toward Eldritch. And he smiled. Now, we shall need to find another challenge for this Eldritch. His laughter was soft, but it carried through the entire realm. End. Part 3. Coming soon. Eldritch sat in Varus's small, dimly lit home, staring into the crackling fire, He had abandoned Duncan's grand house, left it to the servants, to the broken souls that once obeyed the master's every violent whim. It held no meaning to him. He was no ruler, no tyrant. Varos, ever watchful, poured a drink into a roughly carved wooden cup, handing it to Eldritch. "You're still thinking about leaving?" Eldritch didn't answer at first, simply watching the flames twist and dance. "This isn't my place. I need to find a way back." Varos exhaled, leaning back. "Then you already know the answer." Eldritch turned to him, brow furrowed. "Do I?" Varos smirked, taking a sip from his cup. "There is only one way in and out of this place, Eldritch. You know it. I know it. Everyone here knows it." A silence hung between them. Finally, Varos leaned in. "Nocturna." Eldritch clenched his jaw. He had known since he awoke in this cursed land, but saying it aloud gave it weight. Nocturna held the strings. Nocturna controlled the board. Nocturna decided who stayed and who left. If there was any chance of escaping, he would have to confront the god himself. Eldritch let out a breath. "Then I need to find a way to force his hand." The Council of Elders. A looming fear. Across the village, in a secluded gathering hall, the oldest of the elders sat in a flickering candle-lit chamber. They spoke in hushed tones, voices layered with centuries of fear. An elder, Callus, stood. "We have not seen them since Duncan arrived." Murmurs followed. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. Another elder, Tyriel, narrowed her gaze. "And now that Duncan is gone." A silence. Then Callus spoke the words they all feared. "Then nothing is stopping them from coming back." Tension thickened. A younger elder, Lorik, shifted uneasily. "We've had peace for centuries because Duncan kept them at bay. He was strong enough to force them back. Without him..." He exhaled sharply. "They will come." Theriel's expression darkened. "The Blood Warriors." A stillness settled over the room. They had all seen what happened to elders who failed Nocturna's bargain. Those who lived too long. Those who were devoured by the very power they once wielded. They did not die. They became something else. And now they would rise once more. The feeding grounds, Nocturna's whisper. A realm without horizon, stretching into eternity. A land of blackened, pulsating crimson, shifting, writhing, devouring. This was the feeding grounds, the place where fallen elders, once whole, now rotted within the blood-soaked abyss. Nocturna stood at its edge, his form a shifting void, barely distinguishable from the endless night sky above. He raised a hand. His whisper carried on the wind. "The Master is no more." The words slithered across the realm, sinking into the parasitic land below. The ground stirred. The figures, half submerged in the abyss, twitched, gasped, snarled. For eons they had suffered, devoured, melted into the feeding grounds. For centuries they had clawed at the edges of oblivion, waiting. They were elders once. Now they were only hunger. Nocturna whispered again. "The village is unprotected." Their bodies shuddered as they began to pull themselves free. Hundreds of them, twisted, broken, their limbs stretched unnaturally, their eyes hollow pits of endless need. They had tried to reach the village before, but Duncan had kept them trapped, beaten, slaughtered whenever they dared to step beyond the feeding grounds. But now Duncan was gone, and the village stood open. Their sunken mouths widened, stretching into silent, twisted screams, their hollow, red eyes fixed forward. For the first time in centuries, they began to move. Their hunger would not be denied. A knock echoed through Varos's small home, breaking the heavy silence between the two men. Varos sighed, setting his cup aside. "Come in." The door creaked open, revealing an elder, his expression grim. His skin was pale and taut, his once regal features worn down by centuries of surviving in Nocturna's realm. Eldritch studied the man as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He was tall, gaunt, draped in a dark, heavy robe that barely concealed the skeletal nature of his frame. The elder's sunken eyes locked onto Eldritch. "I must speak with you." Varos glanced at Eldritch, who gave a small nod. "Go on," Eldritch said. The elder stepped closer to the fire, the glow casting deep shadows across his sharp features. "There is something you must understand about the Blood Warriors." Eldritch listened. The elder's voice was low, measured, but held a weight of fear beneath its calmness. "Long ago, they came, the ones who had already fallen, the ones who had already paid the price for Nocturna's gift, the warriors who had nothing left but their hunger." He paused, staring into the fire. "We thought we were doomed. They came in a horde, hundreds of them, dragging their half-devoured bodies across the blackened land, seeking refuge in the village, seeking to escape the feeding grounds. But Duncan did not let them." The elder's face twitched, as if remembering something he had long tried to forget. He fought them, endlessly, and he enjoyed it. We watched as he tore through them, again and again. No matter how many came, he never faltered. We thought he would grow tired, but he never did. To Duncan, it was a sport, a game, and so, eventually, they stopped coming. Eldritch leaned forward. "They feared him." The elder nodded. "Yes, Duncan was a monster, but even monsters have their uses. He kept them at bay. We lived under his madness. We suffered his wrath, but at least the Blood Warriors did not return." He turned to Eldritch, his voice quieter now. "But Duncan is gone." A cold realization settled in the room. The elder continued, his words edged with certainty. "They will come again." Far beyond the village, beyond the dark plains, across the endless expanse of the feeding grounds, the land shifted. A grotesque mass of blackened crimson pulsed, the ground twisting, writhing as if something beneath was awakening. And then they rose, hundreds. Elders who had once ruled with power, now reduced to shells, their bodies fused with the land, their forms twisted into something inhuman. Some dragged themselves forward, their melted flesh still clinging to the feeding grounds, their bones cracking as they pulled free. Others moved with jerky, unnatural steps, their limbs bending in ways no mortal body should, their mouths gaping open in silent screams of endless hunger, their glowing hollow eyes fixed on the distant village. And they began to march. A shadowed figure stood on the edge of the feeding grounds, watching the Blood Warriors move. Nocturna. His presence warped the air around him, his form barely distinguishable from the eternal blackness that surrounded him. A smirk played across his lips. "Let's see how you handle this, Eldritch." The god of eternal hunger watched, amused. For centuries, Duncan had played his role, but now, with the master gone, the village was vulnerable. This was not a test. This was entertainment. Nocturna wanted to see what Eldritch would do. Would he run? Would he fight? Would he fall? Nocturna chuckled softly as the first wave of Blood Warriors moved closer to the village walls. This was going to be fun. Eldritch sat across from Varos and the Elder, the fire between them casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The air inside the home was thick with tension. Eldritch steepled his fingers, his mind already working through the problem. "Tell me," he said, his tone calm but measured. "Has there ever been a way to stop them?" The elder hesitated, his face grim. "Only with brute force." Silence. Varos sighed, rubbing his temples. "Then we are already at a disadvantage," Eldritch said. "I do not possess brute strength, nor does anyone in this village. We could create an army, but most here are weak, withered, barely surviving." He looked at the elder. "Without our elder powers, we are helpless." The elder's expression darkened. "We should never have let you destroy Duncan." Varos turned sharply toward him. "Are you serious? Duncan was a lunatic. If he were here, we'd still be suffering under his madness." The elder did not waver. "Perhaps, but at least we were safe from the Blood Warriors." Eldritch remained calm, his voice cold and logical. "And if we defeat them now, you will have peace. Is that not worth everything?" The elder didn't answer immediately. He merely stared into the fire, as if searching for the courage to admit the truth. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke. "We do not wish to be forced into the feeding grounds, to be devoured for eternity." Eldritch's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe you won't have to." Later that night, Eldritch stood alone at the village's edge, staring out into the endless abyss of the feeding grounds. The wind was still, the sky a void of blackened eternity. The land before him shifted, pulsed, the faintest echoes of voices trapped in the endless hunger. The Blood Warriors were coming. Eldritch spoke to the emptiness. "Come on, Eldritch, this is a game of Nocturna." His fingers curled into fists. His mind raced. There has to be a way to win. He thought of Duncan, of brute strength, of overwhelming power, a force so great that the Blood Warriors never dared to rise again. He did not have that. He never would. So how could he win? What would Winter do? Far away on Earth, a figure stood in silence, staring into nothingness. Winter. The wind shifted around him, his chrome mask flickering in the dim light, his stance unmoving, as if he were listening to something beyond mortal perception. The air grew dense with something unseen, a connection, an unspoken conversation across realms, and then, across the infinite expanse of existence, Eldritch heard a single word, a word not spoken, but pushed into his very being. Fear. Eldritch's eyes widened. Fear. That was it. He had been thinking the wrong way. The Blood Warriors did not stop coming because Duncan was strong. They stopped coming because they feared him. Strength wasn't the answer. Terror was. A slow smile crept onto Eldritch's lips. "Nocturna," he murmured to the abyss. "You've set your game, but now I'm going to play it my way." And for the first time since Duncan's fall, Eldritch knew exactly how to win. Eldritch stood before the Council of Elders, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. The flames flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look colder than ever. "I need workers," he began, "and actors." The Elders exchanged confused glances. "I need fake blood, lots of it. I need fire. I need a bigger beard and hair. I need a bodysuit to make me look massive. Oh, and I need Duncan's armour, and 6 of your biggest, strongest men and women." Silence. They stared at him as if he had gone mad. Finally, one of the elders scoffed. "You want to put on a show? While they force us into the feeding grounds, to be fed on for eternity." Eldritch stepped forward, his presence commanding. "That's how we'll decide whether you live or die." Murmurs erupted in the chamber. Varos slammed his fist onto the table, standing up. "For the love of our ancestors, do as he says," he barked. "He is our best chance. Did he not defeat the Master?" Some of the elders grumbled but relented. Others nodded in quiet agreement. Eldritch continued, voice steady and unwavering. "We will build our illusion at Duncan's house. It is the best location for our deception. I need a trail of blood and bodies leading to it. Make it look like I have already slaughtered many of them before they even arrive." One elder shook his head. "This is insanity. We should fight, not cower behind theatrics." Eldritch turned to him. "Do you have the strength of Duncan? Do you have the power of the Master? Because I don't, and neither do you. If we fight, we lose. But if we make them think Duncan has returned, we win." The elder fell silent. Eldritch leaned in, eyes piercing. "You all fear being sent into the feeding grounds. Then don't be sent. Play your part. Act as if your life depends on it, because it does." The room was quiet. Then finally, an elder sighed. "Fine. What else do you need?" The village comes together. For the first time in centuries, the village worked as one. The smiths hammered metal, forging jagged plates to create a grotesque suit of armour, larger than life, monstrous, impossible to tell if it is even human. The weavers stitched together furs and cloth, creating a massive beard and wild unkempt hair, masking Eldritch's true form. The painters and scavengers collected buckets of deep red liquid, mixing dyes and crushed berries into thick, dark, false blood, enough to paint the streets. Workers lined the village paths with fake corpses, stuffing them with straw and covering them in the illusion of fresh carnage. The blacksmiths pried open Duncan's old armour, reshaping it to fit over Eldritch's deceptive frame. The biggest, strongest villagers were chosen, 6 in total, a mix of men and women, warriors in another life. They would be Duncan's loyal, slaughtered foes, their bodies scattered around the main house, their wounds looking as if they had been torn apart by an unstoppable force. The rest of the villagers boarded up the homes, closing off every path except one, the road leading to Duncan's house. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. They were not warriors, but they had a mind greater than the blade. And now the trap was set. A hunger that never ends. The blood warriors surged forward, an endless tide of writhing flesh and crimson horror, their bodies half-formed, twisted, grotesque. For centuries, they had only known the feeding grounds, their very existence spent being consumed and regenerated in Nocturna's endless hunger. But now for the first time in eternity, they saw land, and they wanted it. They wanted to walk where the land did not feed on them. They wanted to exist without being devoured. They wanted revenge. The first among them crawled onto the solid ground, their bloody, half-melted forms screaming in agony and triumph. Then came more, then more. A wave of horrors, hundreds of them, rising from the feeding grounds like revenants, their faces warped in eternal suffering. And yet, as individual as they seemed, there was one truth among them all. They were connected, bound by the same fate, bound by the same cycle, bound by Nocturna. And so they moved as one. The village, a funnel of death. The front line of the blood warriors reached the first buildings, their grotesque forms dripping with thick blackened blood as they twisted and writhed onto the solid ground. But something was wrong. The village was not open. It was closed, funneled. They should have been able to spread out, overrun the streets, flood into the alleys, but they couldn't. The houses were boarded up. Every path was closed off. There was only one way forward, and as they moved deeper, they saw it. Bodies, blood, torn limbs littering the dirt. Some were real, ripped from the feeding grounds. Some were not, fabricated horrors, designed to look like the aftermath of a massacre. But the blood warriors did not see the deception. They saw one thing. Death had already come, and Duncan had returned, marching toward the house of the Master. The blood warriors crawled, shambled, and charged through the village, their screams echoing like a symphony of torment. Every footstep splashed through the soaked ground, every movement funneling them toward one destination, the Master's house, the place where Duncan had ruled for so long, where he had slaughtered before, and where he waited. They did not slow. They did not question. They moved as one, pressing forward through the village, funneled by the walls, by the trail of carnage that led them onward. Their numbers swelled, the tide of bodies pushing towards the inevitable confrontation, and as the first line neared the house, the torches burned higher, the blood ran thicker, and the illusion of Duncan's wrath was waiting for them. The dread before the storm. As the blood warriors moved through the village, the weight of something unseen pressed against them. Something was watching. Something was waiting. They had spent centuries feeding on the land, but now, for the first time, they felt as if they were being led to slaughter. They did not know fear. Not yet, but soon they would. Eldritch stood still as a statue, dressed in the grotesque, exaggerated likeness of Duncan MacDrustan. The armour was twice its normal size, padded to create the illusion of a behemoth, a warrior larger than life. The fires blazed behind him, their blinding glow creating a wall of burning light. Shadows flickered across the twisted armour, hiding the seams, distorting his true form, making him look inhuman. The villagers worked quickly, adjusting torches, ensuring the smoke and light obscured every unnatural movement. Eldritch turned to a short, stout man standing beside him, a man with the deepest, most thunderous voice in the village. "Remember the words," Eldritch whispered. The man nodded, gripping the makeshift megaphone, a funneled metal sheet forged specifically for this moment. "I will," the man rumbled. The horde arrives. The ground trembled. Then, like an unholy tide, the blood warriors flooded the path to the house, clawing, crawling, trampling over one another in their desperate hunger. A wave of deformed bodies, shoulder to shoulder, crashing towards their prize. And then the show began. A booming, godlike voice erupted through the village. "More! Bring me more!" The deep, distorted command echoed off the walls, shaking the very air. In front of the house, the silhouette of Duncan loomed, enormous, monstrous, barely human, and then the carnage began. The illusion of Duncan tore through bodies, ripping apart limbs, sending blood splattering in all directions. Some were real, remnants of corpses taken from the feeding grounds. Some were fake, carefully crafted dummies, stuffed with red-soaked cloth and meat, meant to explode with each devastating strike. The thundering voice rang out again.
"I have waited centuries too long. Bring them all to me, Nocturna."
From the rooftops, villagers hurled severed limbs into the charging horde, making it seem as if Duncan was tearing warriors apart with his bare hands. Another deep laugh rumbled through the air. "Thank you, Nocturna, for lying to them. I could not wait any longer to destroy them." The laugh turned to a snarl, a guttural growl, something unscripted. Eldritch snapped a sideways glance at the man with the megaphone. That wasn't part of the plan. The man's face was pale with the terror, but his mouth curled into a wild grin, caught in the thrill of the deception. One blood warrior broke from the horde, staggering towards the house. From the shadows, two of the strongest villagers struck it with a massive pole, sending it flying backward. The towering illusion of Duncan stepped forward, towering over the broken warrior. The voice boomed once more. "Come back! I need to destroy! I am the master! I must destroy!" The fear spread like a virus. The blood warriors were connected. One mind, one suffering, and now one fear. The master had tricked them. Nocturna had tricked them. They had walked into his trap. A bolt of terror shot through their connection like lightning. They turned. They ran. They crawled. clawing over each other, dragging themselves away from the village. A stampede of mindless terror, crashing backward into the feeding grounds, vanishing into the infinite abyss. The deep voice screamed after them, giving chase. "Come back! I need you! Come back!" But they were already gone. The village stood in eerie silence. Only the crackling of the fires remained. And then Eldritch exhaled. They had won. Time passed. The remnants of their deception, the fake blood, the severed limbs, the makeshift corpses, were gathered. The villagers worked together, crafting something permanent. They built effigies of Duncan MacDrustan, standing tall and immovable, their monstrous size casting shadows over the village. An eternal guardian, one that would never move, never rage, but would always be seen. The village returned to its quiet existence. For the first time in an eternity, there was no Duncan, no blood warriors, no fear. And yet, Eldritch felt no peace. Once again, he stood at the edge of the feeding grounds, staring into the abyss of writhing crimson. He had done it. "I did it, Winter." A shadow moved behind him. A figure stepped out of the darkness. Nocturna. "Eldritch, Eldritch, what will I do with you?" Eldritch did not hesitate. "Send me back." Nocturna laughed, slow and amused. "You know I cannot." Eldritch's fists clenched. "Then I am stuck here forever." Nocturna smirked. "Maybe not." He reached into the folds of his robes and held out a gem. Crimson tear. It pulsed with unnatural energy, its surface swirling like liquid blood trapped in glass. "Agree to my challenge, Eldritch," Nocturna said. "There are 7 trials. Even I do not know what they will be. Only the tear does. It will transport you to each challenge one after the next. If you fail, well, then you will be my new champion, here for eternity, keeping the balance of this village." Eldritch's eyes narrowed. "And if I succeed?" Nocturna grinned. "Then you will be free. The Crimson Tear, with the aid of the gods, will return you to where you belong." Eldritch stared at the gem. "What are these challenges?" Nocturna's smile deepened. "I won't lie to you, Eldritch. I do not think you can complete them." Eldritch said nothing. "You will have no power, no aid from Winter. Just you, one man." Nocturna's voice lowered, almost a whisper. "The realms you enter will belong to the gods. Maybe Lysanor, maybe Necros, maybe mine, maybe even Earth itself. You will face supernatural being of these realms without power, without strength, just your wits." He tilted his head. "How will you, a mere man, defeat an elder, a lichen, an undead? I have no idea, but if you're willing to try..." He extended the crimson tear. "Just give the word." Eldritch held Nocturna's gaze. Then he took the gem. "I accept." Nocturna chuckled. "Excellent." The crimson tear flared to life, glowing with an intense bloody radiance. A pulse of energy erupted outward, an explosion of crimson light. Eldritch vanished. Nocturna stood alone, watching the last traces of light fade into the eternal black. His grin widened. "Soon, Eldritch, you will be my champion." His voice was soft, cruel. "No one has ever completed the 7 trials." A low chuckle, then a full, booming laugh. "No one has even made it through the first." To be continued in Eldritch and the Crimson Tear.
I should be dead. Nocturna should have claimed me like all the others. fed on me for eternity. But instead, he gave me an offer. 7 trials, 7 realms, no powers, no allies, just me. If I survive them all, I'll be free. But if I fail, I will become his champion, trapped for eternity.
No one has ever completed the 7 trials, Eldritch.
No one has even survived the first. Then let's make history.